available on the website. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to type it in the Q&A box or the chat window, and they'll be answered once the presentation is over. If you connect to the webinar or the audio portion is giving difficulties, please let me know or reconnect using the instructions provided in the email. With that, go ahead and turn it over to Brian.
Thank you. This is Brian Bueling, and thanks for joining. As we mentioned, the topic today is going to be overcoming objections from DITA Naysayers. And just a little bit of background before we get into the details. This is the second of 3 webinars that have been in succession with the intent of trying to help people not so much understand what DITA is. It's been around for a long time. Really understand technically how it works, or technically what the advantages of single source publishing. But once you have the sense that it's a good solution for your organization, maybe you've downloaded Excel, you've looked at how DITA interface and how to publish the DITA Open Toolkit, seen that a lot of organizations, a lot of people, especially from technical writing or IT backgrounds, have had problems getting that pushed outside of the technical publications group. So we thought there were like 3 main problems that we wanted to address. I mentioned before, this is the second webinar. Last month, we found really one of the biggest problems, which is just getting in general projects approved for structured writing, single source publishing, and really DITA in particular. That was recorded. It's available on our website and as well. This is really the second step. So you have enough interest where something needs to be done, but resistance to DITA in particular. And we're seeing this, honestly, this is becoming less and less of an issue. Sometimes it's the point that DITA standard is being hurt by it's being oversold by vendors that have made commitments to it from an editing or management or even publishing perspective. But this is the second step of the process. We'll talk a little bit about getting projects approved in general, to get things to be done, and this is the second step. It's how to implement it. Next, we'll be talking about how to actually measure the cost savings and overall improvements of your system once you have moved over to a DITA environment. So the first was for getting projects approved. This is overcoming objections to DITA as a particular implementation technique, and next month we'll be talking about DITA metrics and measuring the cost savings and overall productivity improvements. So we have an hour together. So just want to provide a little bit of background. We're assuming again that you know what DITA is, you know what XML is, you know how structured writing can be applied to a single source publishing system. But we want to provide a working definition of what we mean by a DITA publishing system and provide a quick overview of what we mean by the architectural components. But folks, is going to be a third point as we talk about the implementation details and inevitable resistance you're going to get by moving from something that's not the architecture that we're going to introduce to it. Throughout this, a couple of opportunities to ask questions via some controlled that we're going to be asking of you guys. But because of the relative number of people, we'd like to have most of the questions that can be submitted via chat to the panelists to be towards the end. And I think we'll end maybe 10 minutes before the end of the hour. We'll officially end at the hour, but I will be on. If there's more questions that need to be submitted, we can stay on for 10, 15 minutes. However, we've had some success. If we go across a particular slide, I can see the questions that are being posed, and so you don't, although we might not address them to the end, you can feel free to submit as we're at that slide, just so you don't forget. And if it's relevant, I might address it right at that time. A little bit about Dakota. We're working with XML since before they were even part of JUT systems. It's one of the components of an XML-based and DITA-based publishing environment. You have to have some environment to edit new content in DITA or XML. The other two areas are content management system and then some way of publishing. That encompass with the technical support and data conversion really is what Dakota systems provide. We don't redevelop any type of editing, content management, or like XSLFO publishing technology, but what we see most of the success isn't so much choosing one component or another, it's everything together and making sure the expectations are set with the timing of the way you roll out a system. And so in this for a long time, and the need for these types of systems continue to grow outside of traditional technical publishing. It's the same techniques that we're introducing here are used. There's no geographic focus, and there's no industry focus either. We're amazed at the uses of data in legal services, financial services, commercial publishing. Although it's been designed for technical publishing, because of the adoption of all the software around it, it's been used in many different industries. Although our core has been technical, as you can imagine, over the last 8-9 years, that people don't want to pay for people to develop; they want to learn how to do it themselves. So, including Services 2004, and then with this kind of trend of outsourcing either the support or the actual hosting of the services. We've introduced a couple years ago as well. Before, in particular, publishing and metal is used, although the focus oftentimes is in manufacturing or electronic software documentation. We've uses in commercial publishing, government education, and other. It's important to note that 5 years ago, DITA was a growing but small part of what we do, but over the last years in particular, we see that in many cases it's the default implementation for many new projects. Where the resistance, and we'll get into in a little bit, is when there's been early adopters about publishing and they already have a standard in place, or maybe they're not so much just in the traditional technical publications realm. But it's important to know that what we're talking about in DITA for tech pubs is applied to other industries and applications as well. And as obviously, my name is Brian Bueling. I'm the director of Dakota Systems. My goal in general is to make sure that our new implementations have the right moving pieces, to make sure they have the right software components. So if you get that foundation right, with the right XML, the right editing software, the right CMS, the right publishing, you're 80% of the way there. Okay, so getting into, for those of you that every 50 on the phone that have sat through dozens of these presentations, that they know about DITA, they've worked with it, there's one or two that it might still be new to. And for those that have worked with structured writing and single source systems, none of what's in DITA isn't new. It's been around since you've heard component-based database publishing automation, XML authoring. The terms have changed throughout the years. DITA is one application that everyone seems to have agreed to in the software community. The way that it handles topic reuse, the way it handles content references is less important than the overall structural approach. So to get into the technical details of DITA, there's plenty of resources from it, but if you're brand new to it, everything that you've learned about components writing in the past, everything you've learned about structured writing or single source publishing, all of it applies to DITA. DITA is one XML schema that implements all concepts that you've heard about for a long time. And it's important too, when we introduce DITA, it's a publishing environment. I know it's an XML standard, but what we're really talking about when you're moving to publishing is more than just the standard itself. It's more than just coming up with the way you're going to use the DTD or the schema. We're really talking about is a system. And it's a system that comprises, and we'll show a visual representation in a second, but you're talking software and hardware components. There's software that has to either be modified or purchased. This is why we've worked so closely with XMetal. There's a content management system that has to manage the DITA maps and the topics, the content references. And then there's publishing. Once you convert everything to DITA, you have no formatting associated with it, so you have to have some way of publishing it. So we're dealing with a system that actually enforces content. You're not converting to it. It validates every step along the way when you're editing and when you're storing it in your database, and you're using DITA. You're not converting to DITA just for publishing. And the whole purpose of this is so documents can be reused across different formats, like a website or a PDF, or different document outputs. You have profile versions, maybe for a teacher, maybe for a student, maybe for an advanced installation guide, and maybe for a user guide. And you have that come from the same content. So talk about objections to DITA naysayers. It's objections to this. It's always a system that looks like this. And I'm amazed as I go through the years looking at our partners, looking at our implementations, looking at textual diagrams, how similar this model has maintained, as it has been maintained over the years. There's always different groups and contributors. There's separate software, even to this day, that comes from a specialized vendor for editing that's very good at creating the DITA output. Jet Systems is a great example of that. But the content repository software, there's a separate software component that has to be purchased and integrated with for the content repository, separate software for purchasing the SLFO, the websites, now ebook, applications, Android applications. They're becoming the big push. So what we're talking about is moving to an environment like this. And it doesn't matter where you are right now. You might even be overcoming that DITA naysayers very applicable to you, even already using DITA, because you might be in a position where you have XMetal in your content, and maybe you're using DITA Open Toolkit off of a file system, but then you want to move to a content repository, and you'll see some resistance. So the more these characteristics are applicable, the more DITA is alternative for you. The more multiples you have, the higher number of formats you have, your volume, the more complex they are, the more opportunities for reuse, the more languages that you convert to, the more you can't sell one of your products without the documentation, and the more critical it's linked to the production process, the more it's a good fit. And so before we go through the implement process to try to get DITA to be work from a technical perspective, you need to use this list to kind of cross-check how many languages do we have, what's the opportunity for reuse, what's the volume of content, how complex are they in terms of tables and linking, and then how outputs are we publishing to. And this is the last kind of background slide what we'll get at. Inevitably, this is the overall goal, where you're writing indirectly. You're storing the topics and conrefs into a repository where they can be managed independently, and then you're pushing out that single source topic to multiple outputs. Everyone's striving towards that, but there's natural evolution to this. DITA means very different things. Starts with convert content to DITA and editing directly in, and then automatically applying formatting. If your content is converted to DITA and you have style sheets to reproduce, let's just say, a printed output, that's the first phase. And no sense, and we get into implementation details in other presentations, of skipping ahead to content management if you can't have that basic DITA conversion in place. If you have that base conversion, you have an XSLFO, let's say, to PDF, then different versions using profiling and then adding other XSLT or other transformations to have other formats. That's what the custom publishing is. That's really when you start seeing the return on your data conversion and investment. And again, we recommend and we push getting it right before you move to a content management software. If you don't have the inputs right for the editing and you don't have the publish process right for the profiling and different formats as an output, you really can't get the content management piece right, which controls the inputs and the outputs. Then moving to a dedicated content management system that manages the workflow, the reuse, it can start tracking some of the metrics. However, we see a lot of successful DITA implementations not needing to go through all the way to content management. They can either stop at automatic format, move on to custom publishing, and then it's a big jump to content management, but it's not required to have a successful system to do there first. And the last step is really what people are striving towards. It's to switch around the distribution of the content that's in the content management system. We're in a content management system. The internal resources, the technical writers, the information managers, the managers are deciding what a user guide is. They're deciding what languages to translate. They're backing up and they're creating the DITA maps for distribution. We're seeing a lot of excitement in creating consumer-based user interfaces that allows them to pick and choose the topics that they want, to allow them to choose the profiling options, and for them to provide the format that they want it. And so the first question we have after we've gone through this background, we've introduced ourselves from Just Systems to Dakota Systems, is to ask you as the attendees, where are you if you did DITA along this process? Have you converted to DITA and you're using file sheets outside of a CMS? Are you using profiling for custom publishing? Have you migrated to a content management system? And the step, are you allowing people outside of your company to go in and pull into your content management system and content themselves via that content assembly? So it's going to be the first poll questions before we get into the meat of the presentation. Can you set?
Yeah, it's running. Just waiting for answers.
Okay, great. As we're going through that, I also now would be a time if there's any questions that you think are relevant to the background of what DITA is and and the importance of DITA publishing. And because now we're getting into really where we are at the beginning of this presentation, where you already understand thoroughly your work process, you understand your content, you understand DITA, it makes perfect sense to you. You know the tools that can be used. You have some idea of the cost that's involved, but you're still getting some internal resistance. There's many areas, like day in and day out, we build as a company, or we propose systems that are very, very clear in our minds that would improve their internal processes, whether it's for a tech pubs group, a commercial publisher, or other industries. But we see the same resistance come over and over again. And the most common ones that we see over and over again are, DITA's too expensive, budgetary management. It's complex from a technical writer. It's too technical. You should spend the time either to specialize it, but then it's too complicated to specialize it. Let's build our own custom DTD. Or from an internal solutions architect saying it's not our standard. So as we looked at this, it's really a shame that if we go to the trouble, we really find a solution that's better for a company, that, and many times we even have enough momentum, something has to be to solve the problem. This is what we talked about, getting that momentum just to get a project approved in the first webinar, that it fizzles out because there's some descent into the path that we go to. There's two basic arguments. One is really an argument against XML-based single source in general, and then DITA-specific arguments. When you look at some of the resistance that we've seen, DITA expensive. Thing you should think about anytime you hear a piece of resistance is to see which category it falls into. And DITA is too expensive really has anything to do with DITA. They're talking about XML publishing in general. It is too complex. Again, that could be not so much a testament statement against DITA as it is about XML editing versus maybe a technical writer coming from Word or unstructured frame. Generic and DITA are standard. They're examples of people that are built in, or they buy into XML single source publishing, but they disagree with it as a standard. And as you can imagine, that as we go from year to year to year, the distribution of resistance, it kind of shifts. We're kind of moving past the idea that XML applied to technical publications isn't the best way of handling it. But there's been a little bit of resistance, especially if they've already tried this. Maybe not both, maybe they use their standard, maybe they paid all their money for a custom DTD to move to DITA at this point. So this is the first thing to do time you see some resistance, is to see, are you really arguing about DITA or the underlying architecture? And a lot of time, and we had a lot of success kind of dissecting the arguments and not making the mistake of arguing against DITA when they're really talking about XML or vice versa. But recently, we see that the resistance is coming from two. It's not what the arguments are here, it's where they're coming from. And this is where the title comes from. They're coming from people who really know anything about it, and it's not their job to, or to be a technical expert, but will to refuse or oppose DITA on authority. Or will say it's not possible, and they have very specific technical reasons why DITA is not the right solution. And surprisingly, when we looked at these two categories, this is, according to Merriam-Webster, exactly what a naysayer is. It's a person who denies, refuses, or opposes something, or a person who says something will not work or is not possible. And those are exactly the two categories that we see. When we look back, we're having a pretty high success of getting DITA publishing systems in place when they make sense, but it's still 100%. And of those situations, because of non-technical reasons, a project is deferred or canceled, it inevitably falls into one of those two categories. So one to look at, and it's really most important, and it's worth noting that if we were to look at our projects that were deferred or canceled, where we were posting a DITA implementation, you can imagine, actually I changed it webinar, that the person who says something will not work or not possible 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 4 years ago, right as the standard was emerging, that was the prominent source that was successful. Now it's harder to say that there's not acceptance in the vendor community for software. It's hard to say that it's not going to work in their industry. It's hard to say that there's not XSLT or the DITA Open Toolkit has flaws, or there's XLFO technologies in really where it needs to be to meet the PDF outputs. So that becomes secondary at this point. Most of the resistance that's successful comes from people who know nothing about DITA, and they don't really care about DITA. But they are in a position of authority to deny, refuse, or oppose an implementation. The three guys, I say guys meaning men or women, that we encounter when we're trying to put in a system, and this is after a company agrees that something has to be done, and after we've done the legwork and we're convinced that is the right technical approach. Our CFO, budget manager, solutions architect, or the software vendor. First one to look at, and we spent a lot of time talking about this in the first webinar. It's make sure, and there's a lot being written about this because it's a very interesting topic, to translate the technical advantages of DITA into the financial advantages that can be approved in an internal budget office. And in general, the first thing is to be done. And I rehash a lot of what we talked about in the first webinar for those of you that sat in there, but there's two points. One is that it's not sufficient. If you're jumping into coming up with an ROI or coming up with DITA metrics before you have some idea of how to explain this in one sentence, why it makes sense to go to DITA? It's to reduce translation costs. Or are you going to that? We have a new product that's sold in Saudi Arabia and we need to convert to Arabic. Or we need a iOS application for an iPad and we need structured way, an automatic way of converting. There should be one sentence, non-technical way of describing the need before you jump into this level. Second is, before you get into all the details, we have examples of spreadsheets that have been successful, and there's lots of them available where you can fill in all these little details. The point is you have to come up with an agreement on how you're going to value the cost savings. And this one, it's simple, that we use over and over again. It's not getting into a lot of detail, and it's generally accepted. And it includes a couple things that are worth noting. The first, as a point of agreement for what the ROI calculation will be, and that's sometimes 90% of the battle, because if you can articulate that you actually understand a reasonable way of valuing the cost savings, everything else kind of falls into place. But there's 4 things you have to clear understanding of before you start talking to these budgetary managers. And what's the cost of implementation? It's silly, but you have to know how much the software is going to cost. You have to know how much the data conversion is going to be. You have to know how much the training is going to be, the development. You have to know how much the hardware is going to be. You have to know how much the resources are cost, how much resources are cost, and whether you count those figures or not. How much you spend from your risk job in one of these systems, does that count or does it not count? And it doesn't really matter what the answer is, it's what's accepted in your organization. So you have an agreement on what the cost is. And you shouldn't be foolish and say that it's $10,000 or $20,000 if you're going to have 5 technical writers spending 10% of their time over the next 4 months working on something. So make sure that the cost includes everything that they want to see. The second is find out some way of determining the cost savings. And I see way overblown estimates of what the cost savings are going to be. But a reasonable way is just ask the overall cost of publishing your library is, and just an agreement of what that is. And let's say it's $1,000 per publication. But one of those two numbers, they can have the target of the reuse factor. And it's not exactly right, but people outside of technical publications will understand that if you can increase the reuse by 10 or 15%, then there's 90%, 85% of the topics in your database. That means that, well, there's 10% less topics that have to be reviewed, that have to be written, that have to be spell checked, that have to be formatted, and you can roughly say that the cost of supporting your operations will be reduced by that amount. Then this is a project starts, and then conservatively, and this helps, you say, we're only going to meet 15% or 50% of our objectives in terms of reuse. We think we can achieve this over a 2 or 3 year period. But then if you put in a success factor, you get a number that's reasonable. So even with this oversimplified model, you can see it gets into some complexity. It doesn't matter what the formula is, as long as the agreement to what the formula is before you go out and do your research. The problem we see over and over again, people are counting topics, they're going through and trying to come up with all this financial information before there's an agreement on exactly what formula they should use. It's not so much as formula of your ROI calculations right. All the time it's just a test to make sure you're avoiding some errors. And I've listed them here. I'll just go through a few of them. Sending internal resource costs. Either include that or not include them, but if you have a project team of 5 people, each getting paid $50,000 or $60,000 a year, spending 25% of your time over a 4-month period, you could see that internal resource cost could do software data conversion. Hand productivity. Sure, there's going to be productivity gains, but I love XMetal. I love these CMSs, but it's not the productivity gains aren't going to come the first day. It's going to be harder for the first 6 months. You're going to be slower, and then you'll see the productivity gains over time, and whether it's included or excluded. Budgetary costs against budget, costs against across budgets, travel for consultants, internal hardware purchases, is that included externally? Making sure you get the budget cycle right. We've come up with great cases in October when it should have been June, and we just have to wait. So sometimes you have to know when the cycle of purchasing is. I talked about factoring in risk, and then looking at the ROI horizon. A couple cases we came up with. Really the case that over a 2-year period, this makes a lot of sense for a company, but didn't want to hear that there's going to take a year to implement it, and there'd be productivity losses for the next 6 months. It would take a year and a half afterwards to really see the advantages. So they cut off. They wanted to see ROIs within 12 months, 6 months, and back to understanding before you engage with this most important Naysayer that is too expensive. Make you understand what the rules for the decision is. Go out and do your investigation. So there's a lot of talk on that. If you're interested in that topic, I guess there's 2 resources that we can send you. Just send me an email. One is, my email's down here. One is the link to the live presentation that focused just on that one very important point of resistance, which is the cost. There's a work from last month. And then also, although I said avoid it, we do have templates for very detailed spreadsheets that you can go through after the parameters have been decided. The next area of authority that we see is the standards architect, and it'd be a great solution for your department, but especially with larger companies, with acquisitions. You might be acquiring. This happened before, and it was very, very painful for us. We put in a great full show and went through all the evolution. We had the dynamic content assembly and the self-publishing with DITA, but it was acquired by a company that had a custom DTD. this one is difficult, and the one thing that you have to do when you approach an environment like this is realize that realistically, what is an optimal customized environment for your department might, from an enterprise level, be more expensive. If you just concede and you understand that there is this potential where data might be perfect for you but not best for the enterprise because of some fixed costs that have been put in already, I'll at least start the dialogue. And the solution here is hard for us because we want to put it throughout a huge throughout the organization. Is oftentimes like a conflated word has allowed it to survive in a couple of implementations where you say data will be stored and managed and maintained in this department, but we'll build transformations to load it in and make it consistent with a larger data warehouse. And so, this is the one that's often very difficult for us to deal with. Another is for vendors, and this is becoming less and less important now, but as vendors, especially over the last 2 or 3 years, they've gotten better at this, but as they build in customizations into their CMS or their editing environment or their publishing environment to handle certain versions of data, maybe they include specialization, maybe they don't, maybe they handle conrefs a certain way, maybe they have a data map editor. If they know there's some limitations of data in their environment, or for larger organizations have pushed for DITA, they might have put in custom element, it becomes very difficult for them. And the way to deal with this is to address whether it's an editor, a CMS, or a publish software in specific ways in the way they handle data map. How they handle conrefs for additional tests, how they handle repurposing of a topic with data maps, and see how they handle custom documents for profiling. And in many cases, once you break down the data standard into the 3 ways that it implements reuse, oftentimes you'll see that the limitations of a particular software vendor, if you make a commitment to it, you can't move to another one, is, from a tech perspective, it's very achievable. So the second thing that we're interested in is those of you that use DITA. I'm curious to see how many of you implement these 3 different types of reuse. If you've converted to DITA, are you using DITA maps? Just because you're using DITA maps doesn't mean you're actually reusing content. Are you using conrefs? And then are you using documents with profiling? And the question isn't so much is the plan to use it, but are the software components that you've chosen, do they support each one of those 3? So he's going to submit the second poll now. And so the way the poll comes up, it's allowing one, and it's not mutually exclusive. So I would say, which of the one is most prevalent to support your reuse? And I'm not going to bias you guys, but I'm going to say we use DITA for most of our reuse. So and that's it. It'd be helpful to see if you are finding resistance from other areas where from positions of authority, other from the budgetary perspective, an IT kind of governance perspective, or a software vendor. We don't have resistance from legal departments or the department, product managers, marketing. Those, it's becoming less and less of an important detail. It doesn't really matter how, And, one thing, too, sometimes it's best, we pride ourselves on liking the standard and being good at it. Oftentimes it's better not to even mention that if the capability of the system lends itself to an XML-based implementation, this is a level of detail that is not worth, explicitly getting through. Let's ask, because the area we see the resistance coming from are people that actually know DITA, and they worked with it in the past. They might have had successes, might not have had successes. And then, there are three where we see the other category, where someone who says something just will not work. Now, in general, I love this in general because it's virtually impossible to prove something will not work, and it's very easy to prove something will work. So you'll see that the answer is, in general, it's to move away from the theoretical discussion of whether DITA will work and move very quickly to a prototype to demonstrate that it will. The technical writers, the biggest complaint you can imagine is that technically it's not going to work being able to represent the content. It's practically it won't be able to work because they know the reviewers, they know the other writers, and it's just too complex. Excel, other systems which they do a great job with their user interface. It's still representing XML content, and it's more complex when you look at it compared to Word or Notepad or other very basic editors. And the complaint of the standard, very clearly, is that there are lots of elements and attributes that aren't used at any particular case and any site. And the way to address this is twofold. One is that it is a more complicated interface. There's a lot more going on there than if you were just working in an unstructured frame or Word, or even in InDesign if you're just typing in content. But your job is changing as a technical writer from for a particular output to a content contributor. We're writing a topic that's used on a mobile device, that could be used on a website, that could be translated into Portuguese or Japanese, that might be in context of a printed page, might be pulled out just on online help, and it's much more complicated. It's a much more involved process writing for that. So consequently, the tool should reflect that. Everyone else's job is trying to in this single source publishing environment. This isn't really to talk in general about the process in general, but it's intended just to talk about some example. So the second thing is to focus on the tools themselves. Excel, all these DITA-based tools have a very strong capability for customizing user interface. And so you explain that the user role more complicated, but then also that you have the ability to simplify the environment. And this is where a prototype really helps. Most of quote-unquote DITA customization has to do with simplifying the user interface. Comes from CMS consultants. Typically have one of two biases, and it's either they're in an industry where other standard is prevalent, pharmaceutical, aerospace, commercial publishing, or they're fixated because there's somewhat of a conflict of interest on stabilizing the DITA environment for a particular site, and that also means that they would probably be working through the specialization for you. And the big thing here is for the editors that have the things about what the user interface is going to be too complex, and the CMS consultants that are convinced that the generic data isn't going to work, it's to walk them through the implementation. And many times you've heard concept, and then you go through requirements, and then you go to development and deployment. The only thing I want to point out here is I would recommend building a system based on requirements in order to determine what your requirements are. And almost without exception, you can't get past this CMS consultant or the technical writer without showing something. That's the great news right now, where 3 years ago it might have been more expensive. You might have had to have a consultant come in to build a prototype for you. Most of the tools have out-of-box functionality where you can address some of these issues without a lot of time and energy. The last area is in internal development, where we used to see this for web content management initiatives or learning content management initiatives that were in parallel to technical publications development. Now it's coming from active ebook development and iPad development, where they take extracts of their data and then they build these really nice looking sites that have quite a bit of usability, and they have another data store that's separate from DITA. And all you have to do here is, and we'll talk more about this next webinar, is look at how that system would be supported. If you start from the front end on a format-driven environment, the Achilles of those systems, I think you all know, as you come from an InDesign type setting, it's the supportability and the updatability of those and the tracking of what content you use where. Summary, I had 1 or 2 questions that I want to address, and then also give some other time for questions that might pop up. And we look back, and we think we do a good job of building these systems. We think we do a job of convincing people rationally whether to use it or not. And there are conclusions that we've come. I think they're representative of the state of the industry as a whole. One is we haven't had a lot of success looking, and this is in no order of preference. If the DITA Open Toolkit is going to eliminate or reduce the need for style sheets or software development to create outputs or to create online websites, we've seen that those haven't held true. The justification is based on the DITA Open Toolkit. We've seen that the projects tend to fail and to go back to the beginning. And for that, is DITA Open Toolkit complicated? And as you go through the evolution of these DITA public systems that we looked at before, it can support like formatting, great. Some publishing, great. You can plug it into most CMSs, great. The problem is when you want to have the dynamic content assembly where people are clicking on different topics and then publishing it themselves, it's too slow. We've had to build our own style sheets, our own methods for generating it out, because people are expecting those to be instantaneous. If you're forcing DITA into an environment where you're going to be specializing it to a great extent, we've seen a lot of times where we've fallen back to a custom DTD. Because when this is important to look at, in some considerations with XMetal, what happens when you overly specialize the content? Are the same capabilities in the underlying software available for Conrad, for data maps, and for the publishing? And oftentimes, you lose the advantages of the built-in customization of software once you specialize. This is when we deal with aerospace and defense. They're an emerging standard called S1000D, and it's hard to get into those environments. Publishing, pharmaceutical industries, financial services industry, they tend to lose out. Commercial publishing, there's a lot of time and effort that's being put into making sure the terms are right. And we just came back, even translating the terms. So the elements and attribute names, not just the values, are in the localized languages and they're in the schema itself. And it seems to make sense. Even companies made a investment in DocBook. All the advantages of DocBook to DITA. It's really a generation of an industry standard for technical applications, and more than not, since they already convert to DITA, it's easy to translate their content into DocBook. It's easy to translate their content into DITA. The conversion cost is low. Lastly, and this is the most important, if it makes sense technically for an XML-based publishing system using a DTD, is not going to work. We don't work with very many fashion industries or newspapers that each page has to be like a work of art. Each one changes. There's no reuse. If XML doesn't make sense, DITA's not going to shift the balance. Those are the main points. It's continually evolving, and at this point, if there's any other specific objections that you've heard, and this is the case where you've already done the research and you have a solution in mind, it works from a financial perspective, but you're still getting resistance, I think it's worthwhile, to talking about it. And so, there's a question that came up. It says, the resistance is coming from the field. Our consultants and experienced consumers are used to using our existing documentation, so where to find the details, and equate database documentations with items in the implementation of their documentation. They say they can find where they need in the IM docs. And there's two aspects of that are pretty apparent, and it's common. So one is this falls into the people that have experience with the documentation. And I'd say this is like an experienced user. And the CS consultant, the things I would say to this is practical perspective, the presentation of the documentation and navigation to the end user really should be independent of the DITA standard. And this is where the DITA Open Toolkit comes in. People don't like the output that comes from the DITA Open Toolkit, and if you're relying on that, you're going to have problems. So if already associating a certain navigational and distribution user face with DITA, it's probably the DITA Open Toolkit rather than anything else. And we see that almost without exception, you get DITA Open Toolkit. It's worth the energy just to build something that's customized to the output. And the second point is you're not going to theoretically win this argument. You have to show that you can have another presentation that's separate from the DITA Open Toolkit in some type of pilot or proof of concept. There's lots of companies that can help out with that, or even maybe in the next presentation we'll give some examples of how the DITA content can look very different than the Open Toolkit, but to show it to them. And then other point is some objections come not from the fact that we oversold the use of the Open Toolkit, not providing the out-of-box search, or we haven't figured out ourselves yet. And yeah, that's right. DITA doesn't solve problems of dynamic content assembly. It doesn't have a mechanism for fixing it. And not to go into detail with handling this, but we do a lot of work, and we're really excited about this dynamic content assembly. We're so much about the architecture, but what's needed is a distribution environment. We've had a lot of success within XML indexing tools. One's called ExistDB that provides search capabilities, and there's a more expensive one called MarkLogic. Another question that comes in, since it's coming from some readers who are stuck in the frame world, They're definitely moving to DITA and will start the implementation within a month. Any suggestions for training or influence? The question is right there in the question. I think it's really important early on in the process to have some training for these writers, even before you've moved to, or even when you're in a requirements gathering phase, because the training, if you introduce the editing environment in particular, and we'll use XMetal as an example, there's lots of complaints that you'll get, even if they're stuck in the framework. Why does this not work like unstructured frame? Why does it not work like Word? But if you train them on the baseline XMetal, which is quite good, you'll have the ability then to take feedback and their reservations, and very quickly you can move items around, add to the CSS, and make some adjustments. Not only are they part of they learn more about the technology, but then they have some indirect input into the requirements as well. Another question, DITA often loses when the required CMS lacks support for conrefs or integration with LL systems is poor. That is exactly right. We're seeing that, and it's right here. That every CMS vendor that deals with documentation is on a different part of the spectrum in terms of DITA compatibility. And oftentimes that if you make it into the underlying software, you're kind of tied to them to get a point where they can support DITA in a way that you can use it. And the only point that I wanted to bring up was really, if you talk to these CMS vendors, they'll say, yes, we support it. Well, what would it mean? You have to be very specific on how do they handle conrefs, how do they handle dilemma maps, how do they handle profiling, and then also how do they handle specialization. And all I can do is we've seen many cases where DITA made sense, and it would didn't take the approach of, and the last thing, and I think we'll cut off officially, but I can stick on for some questions. We built a system that converted data, put the style sheets, handled the custom profiling, handled the distribution, and we did all this work, and oftentimes it takes 6, 9 months, sometimes a year, and we did in parallel, and we worked with the software vendor, so I think it was 8 months later, once they released better support for DITA, we moved the content over. And so this is where it's very important that if this becomes DITA content management becomes part of your initial implementation, a lot you can do if the CMS sometimes is too expensive or if it lacks support for DITA you're looking for. There's a lot of work to be done in these two areas before you even consider the content management. Coming up right at 1 o'clock, Avi, I think as far as recording goes and officially closing the presentation, it'll be a good time. But I can click on. There's at least 2 or 3 other questions if people want to hold on.
Yeah, well, I'm just going to end the webinar though. Thank you for sharing all the information and your experiences. Thank you for everyone who participated. We're glad you could join us today. Once again, we'll be sending out the recording of this later today, and it will be available on our website as well at xmetal.com/webinars. Also, like Brian said, he'll be available for questions after this session. If we don't get to your question in that time, we will answer it in an email at a later date. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.